This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software. Developers, are you ready? It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. Choose your language. Choose your tools. Choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. When you can make faster decisions, there's no telling what you'll create. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
Hello everyone, this is Kanchan Shringi for Software Engineering Radio. Today we welcome John Ellithorpe to our show. John's passion has been building software systems to solve complex problems, which he has done at many companies. John co-founded Model N, he was CTO there, and helped grow it to a global public company. John is currently the EVP and Chief Product Officer at DNA Lexus. I know John through my network. John, it's so great to have you here. Welcome to Software Engineering Radio.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
Is there anything in your bio that I left out that you would like our listeners to know?
No, I think the interesting part of my background is I started as an astrophysicist and then turned into a software engineer. So I have a strong appreciation of both science and technology.
Our topic today is the role of a CTO. You being a CTO, there's a lot of confusion in the industry about this role. Many companies don't even have it. Some companies call the VP of engineering the CTO. In your view, what is the core role of the CTO and when is it needed?
The core role of a CTO is really to understand deeply where technology can be leveraged and to be able to map that into the directions of the business and to then use technology to bring value to what that business is trying to do.
What is the organizational hierarchy, though, between the CTO, the CEO, and the EVP or VP?
I think there are many different versions of this hierarchy. I think if I look at the different fundamental pieces that are needed in a company, you need the technology direction to be set by this the CTO, the role of the CTO. The engineering organization, typically led by a VP of engineering, but sometimes somebody named the CTO, is really the person that defines the operational structure of bringing the product to market. And then you have the product organization that looks at the market, tries to understand the business needs, and then bring that to market through the engineering organization. So all three of these facets of the company need to be there. And I think that the structure of the organization that has both the product engineering as well as the technology aspect, these are parallel pillars in the organization that need to be represented in the executive team. And the exact hierarchical structure within that executive team is really more dependent on the different skills of the individuals that are there. Because what you find is that the heads of engineering, the heads of product, and the CTOs, while they have their defined focus into their core areas, they typically bleed over into the other areas. And so a CTO might actually be well suited to operationally manage engineering. A product person may be well suited to understand more of the technology and as well as understand more of the engineering. And so, for example, my role as Chief Product Officer at DNA Nexus, I'm also overseeing the engineering organization, and I have a CTO reporting up to me. But you may have an organization where the CTO can take engineering based on their skills. So I think the exact organizational hierarchy doesn't matter as long as all three pillars are strongly represented in the executive team and drive the direction of the company.
So, in companies that have the CEO and VP of engineering positions, but no CTO position, it would be the VP of engineering that plays the role of the CTO. Is that fair?
For larger organizations, that's true. I think that if you look at early stages in a startup, so if you're just starting a company, it's less clear that you need a CTO. You typically need somebody that heads architecture and can rapidly build something to get to the first generation of a product. It's not really until you get a larger organization, you have more mature products and potentially diverging product lines, that you start needing somebody to be able to really understand where technology is going, and also to look through the product set and define how a roadmap of technology really should look to be able to drive forward in the what the company is trying to do. So in that sense, that you can operate an organization with just a CEO and a VP of engineering once it's smaller, but once it gets larger, the the expansive technology area as well as the operational area gets too large for a single person.
So I expect then that there's differences between the CTO roles for small companies, mid-sized companies, large companies, as you mentioned. But can you talk a little bit more into what these differences would be? What are the different skill sets?
When you're in a small company, and let's say a small company is like sub 50 people, you're on your first version of the product, maybe going on to the second version of your product, the scope is relatively small. And so what's really important is to just have a quick first identification of what the best way forward is, but then you spend 95% of your time building. And so it's more important that you have good tech leads that have some architecture experience to know where to go, but they're heads down building, and you don't tend to think long term about where your roadmap's getting you. You're trying to get to the first release, second release. As your company gets bigger, let's say you're getting into the 100-person, 200-person company, your company's been around for a few years, you've gone through multiple revs of the product, you might be introducing new product lines. That's when your technology decisions start to become more and more important. You Technology ages, so UI technology ages seems to age at the rate of about 5 years for every new technology. Backend technology goes a little bit slower, but even with new SaaS companies, you have lots of infrastructure technologies popping up pretty quickly. And so you get lots of desires by the engineering organizations to leverage new technologies pretty quickly. And so you can easily have a case where you start having more and more technologies in your organization, and you really need somebody to step back and think about where it's going. Like, what technologies are really going to help the value of the company, and how you're going to ensure maintainability, reliability, performance, scalability in not just now and not just in 3 months or 6 months, but in a year, 2 years, 3 years, because technology changes can take a long, long time to implement, and you need somebody looking out pretty far, because the getting it wrong can cause you significant challenges. So that's what happens when you get into a mid-sized company. Once you get quite large, where you're more into 1,000-person company or more, then the CTO, I think, turned more into somebody that's looking at a very coarse level at technologies, how they map the markets, and making sure that you're moving forward. But they tend to move further away from being detailed into the architecture.
So it sounds like there's a difference between being a generalist, which is for larger companies, versus a specialist for smaller companies. Is that right?
I think that's true. I think that an effective CTO at a smaller company not just understands the technology, but they understand the domain that you're in. So whether you're in healthcare or a consumer-based company versus an enterprise-based company, you tend to specialize more into those types of technology. It's a little bit harder to move around. Whereas if you're in a large, expansive company with a big portfolio of products, it's a little bit easier to move around, because you're dealing with very large scale changes in technologies and directions, but you have less influence on the specific architecture of those products.
Does the CTO have any management responsibilities?
In my view, I don't believe that a CTO needs to have direct management responsibilities. Um, in fact, it's somebody who grows up to be a CTO doesn't necessarily also have a track record of building up their management skills. direct management skills, although they do critically need to have soft skills to be able to influence effectively across the organization, to be able to implement the types of changes that they'd like to see happen. But I would say it's, in my mind, it's a little bit dangerous to have a VP of engineering and be also the CTO in the same person, because the CTO needs a longer view, and a VP of engineering operationally has to have a very short-term view of getting products out the door. And so it's a rare person that can actually sit in different meetings and really put on different hats and have a long-term view versus a short-term view.
What does success look like for somebody in a CTO role?
It's a little bit difficult to define success. I think success usually for a CTO is nothing goes wrong. So you can usually identify when things are going wrong more easily than when things are going right. I think that when things are going wrong, what you'll see is that there's no clear path to the architecture. There's typically less rhyme or reason about different parts of the product line and why they work or don't work together, why certain technologies are used or not used. And you'll also see that the technology part of the organization does not interact very closely with other parts, the business part or the sales parts of the organization. And so what that means is that you don't get into the discussions about like how technology can actually add value. And so I think that those, once you see organizations that look like that, you understand that like there's deficiencies in bringing technology to the forefront. The technology is a lot of times used as a enabling feature of a company to be able to bring value, but the true like innovations, I would say that happen typically in technology companies are within the technology side. And in order to really explore where you can actually use the technology to create significant increases in value, I think require somebody that can both talk on the technology side, but understand what the business is trying to do. And so if you see that those discussions don't happen, then a lot of times what will happen is that you'll miss opportunities that can come up where you can make leaps and bounds and potentially significant competitive advantage because you understand how to take technology and apply it in different places. And so while a lot of times you don't see these in the short term, like from release to release, month to month. You may see these things in the long term as companies really try and lay down new foundations in the future. These things, good examples of major changes like these are, for example, just moving into the cloud, where it started with these sort of ASP type models into single tenant models, into multi-tenant models and such. All those are really technology driven changes. We're seeing another revolution happening with containerization and orchestration of containerization and such. Those things can really drive efficiencies and value to certain customers and segments. And so a lot of those are technology driven and are led by companies that have strong technology people driving those.
So, if I could just summarize what we've been talking about, what I understood was you in the company, you need a long term technical vision, which is the CTO role. You also need more of a short term engineering focus, which is typically the VP of engineering role. And you need the product focus. And the hierarchy between these is less rigid. It could change at different companies, but all these functions need to be fulfilled. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, absolutely. That's a fair summary. I view these different functions as parallel peer functions, and they all need to be strong to have a successful company.
Let's drill into a little bit into the hard skills. What are the hard, tangible skills the CTO should have? And I realize, based on your comments, that these could be different for somebody at a small company versus at a larger company. but maybe you could just draw some broad strokes here.
I think, as I mentioned before, a CTO has to be not just proficient and fluent in the technologies that are applicable in their area, but they also have to be fluent on the business side. And so that requires quite a bit of really hard learning, both to maintain what's your technical skills to a pretty deep level, as well as your business skills to try and understand what the company is doing, how the company makes money, how the company brings value to their customers, and what success looks like, not just for the company, but what success looks like for your customers. Now, to be able to leverage that as a CTO, another really important skill is the ability to communicate to the different parties in the language that they understand. So a CTO needs to go back to the engineering organization and describe what's important to very technical engineers and architects in that organization, and they have to be able to do that effectively. And but then they could, in a 5 minutes later, walk into another meeting and have to talk to business people, whether they're product management people, sales people, business development people, or the customers, and then describe how technology can be used to help them and what the technology does, but in their language. So they can't get wrapped up in too much technicalities. They really need to fundamentally understand it and use clear language to be able to describe that. So that ability to change how you communicate, but also really keep in mind what the value is to different parts of the organization is a critical skill. I think another important aspect is the ability to keep up to date. I think that this is quite a difficult challenge, especially as technology changes so seemingly faster and faster as the years go by. So figuring out how to actually maintain your not just a high level knowledge of what technology are out there, but really a tangible knowledge of what is working and not working is also critically important.
In your experience, what are some ways of keeping abreast of these technology changes?
There's the easy answers of like go to conferences and read blogs and stuff. I think that gives you a pretty good lay of the land and some high level understanding about where technologies are going, what's popular, what's not popular, and such. But I think that to get the part that I talked about before, which is really a good understanding of where technology is going, this is where you need to actually leverage your organization. I think that you have an entire engineering organization, typically with lots of engineers that are thirsty for playing with new technologies. And so having people do little prototypes, investigations of what technology is out there, and really like getting some hands-on playing with technology, I think will give you a better idea, and having discussions within your teams about what would actually work and don't work and why, I think is very important. I think that will give you more of a sense of what can actually be used and why. And I would say that that also applies across organizations. I think that it's good to keep a network of other senior technology leaders and have discussions with them about what's actually working in their organizations, and did they try different technologies, and what was working out. When I was at Model N and we were contemplating moving to the cloud with a SaaS-based product, we went out and talked to at the time we were looking at Node.js and other technologies, and we went out and found people who actually did it. We found somebody at LinkedIn and they built their mobile product on Node.js, and we had a long conversation about what was working, how it was working, and the technology was relatively immature at that time. But those were very valuable conversations to understand, like really like practitioners in the world who have used it can tell you what's real and what's not.
So you started to talk about what I would call as the soft skills, which is communicating to engineering and product leadership, and perhaps in different languages. So, can you tell me about some activities one would do to practice or acquire these skills?
I think these are hard to learn. I think these are. I'm a fan of reading books about psychology and typically management management and organization. And so books by Daniel Pink, like Drive, and Daniel Earley, Predictable Irrationality, and such, really help to understand like the motivations and drives of people, and that really helps a lot. I think what you really need to do is, if I pull something from the UX side, which is user-centered design, my view is that that applies to almost every aspect of your interactions with the world. You really have to understand what the other people that you interact with, what they really want, what they're trying to get, so that when you interact with them, and if you're trying to convince somebody that they should be using some sort of new technology or change how they think about what they're doing and why, you really have to understand like what their challenges are, why they picked the certain technologies that they picked, and really be able to formulate your arguments well so that you can influence them in the way that you'd like. And I think those those are critically important. I personally don't like organizations where the CTO has his own organization of architects that sit outside of engineering. My preferred model is that you more have a single lone CTO, maybe like one or two under, but that CTO works with all the lead architects in the engineering organization. So the architect should stay with the different products that they're architecting to really, so that they have hands-on understanding of what's actually going on with their products. And then the CTO can bring them all together and then talk about what's actually working and not working. And so that requires the CTO to have the ability to influence people that they don't directly manage. And so that's a critically important skill. And you talked before about ways to look where a CTO is not working out well. If you have a CTO that feels like an ivory tower, that just writes edicts, and the engineering organization doesn't pay attention to them, that's somebody that doesn't have the exact skill I talked about. And so, but I think if you can build that working relationship where the architects build not only relationship with the CTO but the other architects, that's where you can actually have a very effective organization. We have lots of communication and real discussions about where technology should go. But that also affords you the ability to have certain parts of your organization, like the engineering organization, take some risks, do some pilots, try out things, and then inform the other architects as well as CTOs, like what's working and what's not working. Because you need an organization that is willing to have the courage to do some tests, to do some trials, and see if they work or don't work. Because it's really only when you get hands-on work, especially if you're dealing with very large scale or very large complexity, that you really need to try things out before you understand if they work.
So you said that one of the ways success can be defined is the relationship with the engineering organization and honest bidirectional communication. What about the importance of the executive team, the relationship between the CTO, the VP of engineering, the chief product officer, and the CEO? How critical is that?
I think the relationship between the CTO and the head of product or CPO, that's a very important relationship. I think the just as the chief product officer is trying to define where the product should go to build value for the company, I think that the CTO has a similar type role where they're defining requirements into the engineering organization, but instead of solely to build value to the company, although that's a part, they are also looking at building in the ability to scale well. I think what the CTO looks for is that you don't ever hit a wall in your future. Products are usually built within a certain dynamic range. It says like, it's a certain range of scale or a certain range of customers or something. And you can't build for everything because you just don't have enough money. And so as you grow a company, you typically will always hit those next limits, and the CTO has to see those limits coming and help the engineering organization plan so that they can get through them and refactor to scale as the company grows up and increases the customer base that they have, user base that they have. and moves into potentially more and more products that they might have. And so it's very important that the CTO work with the CPO to really understand and lay out a future where they jointly work at scaling up where the products really need to go. Now, the CTO also has to work with the sales part of the organization. The Typically, it depends how technically advanced the products are. In my organization, the products are quite technical, and so the CTO really has a role to go and help the sales organization describe the value of the product, the value of why they are architected in a certain way, and how that will help the customers directly achieve what they're trying to achieve along their journeys. And so there's an evangelistic part of the CTO role that needs to be done, but it's also very important for that relationship because the CTO really also needs to see how the technology is being adopted by customers and whether it's working or not working, and whether customers actually see that the what the technology trends are and if they're changing. And so then that's a very important input for the CTO as he goes and makes his decisions about where roadmaps should go. Because the roadmaps, with such interconnected environments now, the CTO really has to understand where their product is and then how that's interfacing with the larger environments that are in the customers on the customer side, especially for enterprise organizations.
Do you have any examples about such relationships that you would have established either directly with customers or through the sales team at Model N?
Did you mean between within to the internal people in Model N, or did you mean to the customers?
So, one of the things I got from your answer was the fact that the CTO is really a bridge between the sales team, the product organization, and the engineering organization. And he communicates or has relationships with the customers via the sales team. Is that right? Or is there also cases in your experience where you directly communicated with customers?
I believe the CTO usually goes through the sales team. The sales team, it's important that the sales team maintains all communications with customers to really understand what the customers are trying to do and develop the long-term relationship with the customers. But once a CTO is engaged, typically a CTO may engage with either leaders in the IT organization or sometimes the research IT and other sort of different facets of the organization that are running technology. Those are actually valuable relationships, and then you typically find that within your customer base, you may get a small subset of those customers that have people that are at some level similar to the CTO in a customer, where they're trying to chart their own path forward and really understand how they can take the customer's technical environments forward and really understand that. And so you might find kindred spirits in other organizations, and I've found that in different organizations. And then those are really valuable relationships because not only can you find out what the customers are doing today and what's matching today, but then you can really understand what the customers are trying to do and how they're trying to think about technology in the future. And you can use those relationships to really bounce ideas off of, really understand, like, is my roadmap really like helping you do your roadmap? If not, why? And if it is, really, how can we actually make this work together?
So, what I really get from this is that the network within the company and outside the company is really critical, not just for communication, but also to continue to keep abreast of the technology, because a lot of this focus is obtained by prototypes, which is done by the engineering organization as well. So the network is absolutely critical.
Yes, the networking is definitely critical. I think that there's so much technology out there. It's very difficult to keep up all yourself. And there's so many people experimenting that it's just a very useful resource to go out and find out things, and it could be as easy as a half hour or hour phone call. You can find out way more information than you did by reading a couple blogs um, or listening into a talk at Service Cloud or Salesforce.
So we've kind of talked about the role and the skills needed for the role. Let's talk now about becoming a CTO. So the big question is, how should the CEOs and boards really think about hiring? Is that typically from the outside or grooming someone internally?
I have a bias because I grew from a certain standpoint. I grew into a CTO, so I my bias is that my view of a CTO is they have to be quite technical and have a pretty deep understanding of the products that they are overseeing. And so my sense is that it's better to grow a CTO than it is to bring one from the outside. I think that there's, especially if you get to a larger and larger company, there's so many things that you learn by growing along the way, that are typically in the heads of the engineers, and the scars on people's backs as they built the product. That it's very hard to learn that over time. So if you have people in the engineering organization typically that seem like they could grow that way, then it might make sense, even if it takes a few years. It might make sense to cultivate somebody and mentor them to grow up that way. That might be more effective than bringing somebody in externally. But that's not to say that you couldn't bring somebody in externally. It's just the ramp up will be slower, but you might need to structure a little bit differently. I think that if you grow somebody internally, you may not need a chief architect. I think the CTO can take the role of a chief architect, if grown internally. I think if you bring somebody externally, then you might have more need for the chief architect, or maybe just the lead architects within engineering to really support that CTO in terms of the understanding of what's really happening with product.
Let's say, though, that one does have to hire externally. How does that work? Would you typically have had to have a CTO title in the past to be hired as a CTO? If not, what other roles would be considered by companies when they're hiring for a CTO?
I don't think you need to. Well, if you needed to have a CTO title to be a CTO, then there wouldn't be very many CTOs. So I think that you don't need to have one to be able to be a CTO. But just like any other executive role, I think the obviously the place that CTOs are generally going to come from are the engineering organizations. They're generally going to come from the technical sides, and so what you really have to look for is, it's pretty easy to check the technical aspects of their experience. It's really the business side and those soft skills that are the things that are going to make them really effective. If you bring somebody in from the outside or recruiting, that's the part I think that you have to stress and look for. How effective were they at influencing other parts of the organization? How effective, you should have non-technical people in the interview panel, and then have them ask questions about, like, okay, explain this technology to me, but I'm not a technical person, and do things like that. Those are important aspects for the interview process for a CTO. Because I think a lot of people make the mistake that they assume that because of technology in the title, that person is primarily technology. Therefore, I'll just throw a bunch of engineers at them and then evaluate that. That's typically a mistake. You really need a balance of people, all the people in the organization that person's going to work with, and really review critically how that person can work with all types of people.
So let's say you did end up hiring the wrong person for this role. What problems would occur? What are some of the examples of deficiencies that would crop up?
I think that, as I mentioned before, the the obvious things that will start cropping up are that the influence of the CTO will not be there. And so you'll see that the engineering organization is really making decisions outside the context of the CTO. You'll also see that the CTO is not being included in discussions about where the product's going, and such. And I think that those are all the sort of key indicators. Those are the ones that will typically happen first. And then if you don't handle that situation, don't identify that, then what you'll see is the, the more critical issues that come as the architecture of the product starts to become incoherent, and then you see that when customers start asking questions about why, like, how am I going to integrate with this technology? How am I going to do, like, how does your architecture help me here or there? The CTO won't be able to answer because they just aren't involved enough. And so I think, there are lots of things that you can do, but I think it's really, if you start seeing the lack of communication, those are the leading indicators. And usually the lack of communications coming because of an evolving lack of trust and lack of respect between from the organization to the CTO, because the CTO is not giving them what they want. Right?
Calling all developers. There's no telling what you can create when you upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. Are you ready to build the applications you want, however you want them? Are you ready to develop applications faster than ever? Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
Let's talk more about growing into that role. What is the role of mentors in this process for someone that's growing into the CTO role?
I think mentors are incredibly important. I've been very fortunate in my career to have exceptionally good mentors. And although I don't think they'd be like, oh, they weren't explicit mentors, but I've watching how other CTOs have worked to really help me understand, like, what the real requirements of a CTO are. So I think you really need to look at how, if somebody's growing into or wants to grow into the CTO role, I think first they should definitely try and find good CTOs out there, whether they're in your organization or not. It's always better if they're in your organization already, and then really see how they work. And I think that will really help. If you're somebody like me who I have a CTO now reporting up to me, I think that highlighting all those different aspects, because I think that, as I mentioned, most CTOs grow from engineers, and they don't always see all the things that need to be done. And so it's very useful to, if you're going to groom a CTO, to bring them into conversations that they would typically not think to be brought into, because they think of themselves as engineers. They don't think of themselves as business partners in the company. And so it's really good to expose them to conversations with sales, conversations with product management at a strategic level, even conversation with the CEO about what the CEO wants. Those are really good conversations to see, like, what those people really talk about and what they value and what they're really interested in.
So, what experience would you want someone to have before you started mentoring them for this role? Let's say they were interested in it. What would you still look for them in their experience?
When I look for somebody who wants to grow, I typically look for somebody that has a strong sense of curiosity and a growth mindset, and also somebody who really not just values technology for technology, but values really, like, how you can use technology. And so you can see that as people grow in an organization, especially engineers, where people who are going to grow more out of the core engineering role, typically even early on in their careers, are very interested in things like, well, what's the use case? Like, what is the customer actually trying to do? They're very interested in making sure their technology is actually used. It's not just building it so they get the enjoyment of building it, but they get a lot of enjoyment by hearing other people use their technology. You can start to see that people who grow, that's also true for architects too, but somebody's going to grow into a CTO, they start moving past just those use cases and such, and really start asking questions about, well, why is there value of this product? Like, what are the customers actually trying to do? And so you'll see those type people typically start having more conversations with product management. They get a little more interested in talking about requirements and less about the technology and such. And so those are sort of the some of the indicators that you'll say is like, oh, well, this person may be a good CTO. Of course, that person may also be a good product manager. That person may be a good architect. There are lots of paths that you can go for. But I think that they're willing to keep growing beyond where they were as an engineer is one key aspect.
Okay, let's say I'm a VP of engineering with an operational focus so far. I really want to be a CTO to have this long term vision for the company and contribute to the business. What advice would you have for me?
I think that if a VP of engineering wants to grow into a CTO, it's really starting to think strategically about where the products and company are going, and then look at the portfolio products and technology that they're building, and really understand how they map together and what how they can be used in the future, and really think about that. So they really have to step back and think about that, and away from the weekly grind of sprint scrums, project meetings, and release timeframes. And so I think that it's not easy. I think that you can very easily fill up your entire weeks just with all the day to day grind. And so they need to be able to figure out how to pull themselves out of that, and then spend time really thinking about that. In terms of being able to learn how to do that, that's probably where a lot of conversations with the heads of product can really help. I think to carve out time, talk to the head of product, and then have the head of product really explain to them their view of where the value is and what types of things. Because the head of the product, even though they won't understand technology at a deep level, they will understand at a high level what technology is giving them, and the value propositions and differentiations of the product and such. And so I would encourage the VP of engineering to go talk to the heads of product, really understand that, and then have the time to think about it and ask, probing questions to the head of product about, like, okay, what about, like, if we did this and with this technology, or we did that, how would that benefit you? How would you think about that? And see if you can get the heads of product to understand. It's like, oh yeah, if you can do, like, if you can make this happen or this happen, then that would be very interesting. Start getting in those discussions, because that's where a lot of interesting things can happen, and the value can happen from the CTO role.
Let's talk about upskilling the entire organization. So we talked a lot about one-on-one mentoring, but what are some strategies to upskill the whole organization so they can participate with the CTO in the prototyping and evaluation of technologies?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. I face that in every organization I've built. We never have enough architects and people in the different areas. So I think that you have to look through your organization and then really start identifying who you think are going to be the people who are going to help drive the technology and the architecture of the product. And then it's hard to do, but you have to give them some level of time to be able to really have time to think about the technologies. For example, my current organization, we have budgets to go to conferences for every single person. We give people a little bit of leeway to go and do prototypes. If they want to play with technologies, we let them do that for a little bit and see if they can have small projects that can help drive changes into the product. And so all those things are important aspects to help grow people in the organizations. I mentioned Daniel Pink before in his book Drive. He has a framework where he talks about his so-called AMP framework, where A stands for autonomy, M stands for mastery, and P stands for purpose. And so, for every person in the organization, if you give them the autonomy to be able to do their job effectively, if you give them the time and resources so that they can master their job, but also importantly, if you give them purpose so that they feel that the job is important, then they will thrive in their roles. And I think that there are people in the engineering organization, every engineering organization I've ever been in, that align to wanting to be an architect. And so I'm a big believer in giving them enough autonomy, enough time to master, but also the purpose where the CTO can help give them an understanding of like what areas to look at and why it would be important, not just for you know understanding of what that technology to do, but if you know if they were able to do XYZ with some product, maybe a customer would be very successful. In our world, a customer being very successful might create a new drug therapy and save people's lives. So I think that we can tie very easily to internal motivation. And I think that those things could be done to help bring up people in the organization. Now, there are going to be people at all different levels. And so you have to match people at their level. But in this world, it's really an apprenticeship type world. You have to give people projects, you have to let them do their work. Where the projects can be side projects, but their project can be mainline projects into the product as well. But you have to give them the opportunity to go and stretch a little bit and to be able to make some level of architectural decisions under the guidance of the CTO and other architects, and then give them feedback about what's working and not working. It's not only the ability to make decisions and try things out, but they don't always know what it means that something's actually working or not. So it's also good to provide strong feedback to understand if something will work not just immediately, but will it scale? Is it reliable? Can other people maintain the code? Things like that. There are a lot of factors that have to come into play.
We'll have a link to the book Drive that you mentioned a couple of times in the show notes. So let's talk about a typical workday or work week now. Was there a difference between what you imagined and what the real day-to-day life looked like for you as CTO?
It was probably different. I think I had a lot more meetings than I thought I would as a CTO. But I think that the CTO there's a lot of interactions you have to do as a CTO. And so both keeping tabs with the engineering team, what's happening and such, you're constantly being pulled into the front line with sales and such to be able to support sales and talk to customers, and and then working with the product team to really understand what new projects are coming in and what's important. And then you have to find time to keep up with technology and talk to your network and things like that. And so all those are very important aspects. And so you typically have quite a few meetings, but unlike engineers that typically tend to hate meetings, this is you know, these type meetings are typically very empowering and very insightful as you're learning quite a bit, and this is a sort of a key part of your job to really like learn and take on information. Sorry about my dog. It's very important to learn all the information that you get from these different parties, and then have time to synthesize them and then take action and really understand where to go. Um, but there's also, as CTOs typically always have projects that are going on. At Model N, there was major projects to drive a SaaS architecture. There are projects, they're typically customer-facing projects that may be complex, that require CTO. And so there are long-term activities that happen as well.
So can you comment a little bit about the meetings? Who are these meetings typically with?
I'll say that they're really a mix across the entire organization. I think that an effective CTO constantly keeps tabs on all aspects of the company. So there's a very internal aspect of working with engineering and product to really understand what's actually being developed and then released into production. Those are very important meetings because that's actually the realization of the roadmaps that you're trying to put together. And then, but there are a lot of other stakeholder meetings that you have with sales to really understand what's, as I mentioned before, what customers are trying to do and where they're going and how well your product's actually being received by the market. There's interactions with business development because typically partnerships with other companies, as well as channel partners, you might have system integrators that you work with and such. Those are important aspects and typically very closely related to the technology. You might have system integrators build on your product and such. That's an important aspect to really think about, as well as I mentioned, just maintaining your network and trying to keep up to date of like what's actually happening out there in the technology market. And that would include conferences and such.
What should keep a CTO up at night?
I think what should keep the CTO up at night is really like what's going to bring your company to a halt. I think those are the things that the CTO is the only one that is really on the hook for making sure that the product keeps scaling and that the decisions about architecture are correct for where the markets need them to be. And so you don't want, I'll take very obvious examples. Nobody's building a COBOL anymore, right? So things like that. So you have to really understand where technology is going, and it's not always the best technology wins. Unfortunately, there's a lot of mapping to the technology trends and what may be working, but also what's adopted because technology influences hiring. You have to have people who can actually build and use the technology and very fluent in it. So you need to be able to understand if you can hire people into your organization to do it. It's easier and easier these days, but it's also somewhat impactful for your customers too. If they need to integrate with your technologies, that it has to map to what they want to do. It has to map to overall architectural trends. So we had one trend from, going from on-prem software to single-tenant SaaS to now multi-tenant SaaS. And now there are more issues related to privacy and who owns cloud accounts and things like that. Those are all things that really need to be kept in mind because if you miss a trend and then have your engineering organization work for a year or two down the wrong path, it's very hard to turn that boat around. So these are all the things that should keep the CTO at night. Just making sure that you're going down the wrong path and making sure that path doesn't have any cliffs that you're going to fall off.
John, what did you like best about being a CTO?
I love the fact that you have such freedom of what you can think about. It's being able to think about how technology can be used in extremely positive ways and be a key partner in the executive team to really understand where the company's going and being the key enabler of what a company can do is fascinating and one of the most fun things I can imagine doing. So I loved like being a CTO. I think that it's one of the best jobs out there. So.
Thank you so much, John. Trying to wrap up now, how can people contact you?
Sure, you can contact me on LinkedIn. I also have a Twitter feed at Ellithorpe on Twitter, and we'll post those so that you can get in contact with me.
Okay. Yeah, we'll definitely have those links in our show notes. It's great having you here today, John. Thank you so much.
Great, wonderful to be here.
Developers, take your marks. It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. It's time to deliver complex mission-critical applications in the fastest route possible. It's time to use any data from any source. It's time to embed analytics and create interactive user interfaces. So what are you waiting for? Choose your language, choose your tools, choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Done and done. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform, the fastest way to build applications. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris. Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.